All right, day 3 of debating traditionally. So today we're going to talk about negating. Let's start this off on the right foot. You should never, ever, ever, ever lose while negating in traditional debate. Just ever. You should never lose while negating in traditional debate. All that stuff I told you about how to be aff, that's cool if you're debating someone that doesn't know how to negate. But if you're debating someone who knows how to negate, the negative should win every single debate round. Why should the negative win every single debate round? Yes, the 1 in C, the 2 in R, longer speech times, more times to develop. What else? You don't have to give one particular speech.
The 1AR.
You don't have to give the 1AR. The debate is never real. The debate should be over at the end of the 1AR. You as the negative should make the 1AR literally impossible. You should give the 1 in C, the 1AR should drop everything, and it should be an auto win for you. There should be no excuse for losing while negating in traditional debate. The only reason you should ever lose is when the aff figures out that they can just give a stand-up 2AR and just waft loftily about something important, and you just didn't have a good preempt to that. That's the only time you should ever lose, and you should still never lose to that. In terms of technical flow debate, you should never, ever, ever lose while negating. So, here's why you should never lose. Let's talk about casing. If we structure our 1 in C, the case and the refutations to the aff correctly, and we do our prep correctly, you can read functionally the exact same negative case and negative responses to every affirmative case and get super practiced with it and make the 1AR literally impossible. Plus, we can cheat while we're negative. It is much more difficult to cheat while we're affirmative. We can cheat while we're negative, which makes it very, very easy. Let's start with the casing part. The first part is that it needs to be really short and sweet. 2 minutes, 3 minutes max. Any more than that, and you're doing it wrong. People with really long negative cases shoot themselves in the foot and do disservice. Because people are prepared to debate negative cases usually, people are not prepared to debate their own case. You want to keep it short and sweet. More time to spend refuting the affirmative is a better trade-off than developing another contention. If you have another contention you want to add in because you want to make your negative case 2 contentions, just read that other contention as a response to the aff. You're generally fine. You want this to 2 or 3 minutes, really short. Just a short framework, short contention, you're good. The second thing is not just that it's short and sweet, but that it is abusive, which means that your NC should be a nib. What is a nib?
Necessary but insufficient burden.
Yes, a necessary but insufficient burden, which is a burden that your opponent must meet to not lose, but meeting it does not ensure that they win. Okay. Yeah, let's start. This room's not hard to find. Madeline?
Amy?
Or Amy? Does not appear that you are...
Oh.
What's your last name?
Pham, P-H-A-M.
You're supposed to be in, winning with a critical aff.
I switched my mod a couple days ago to be on this track.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll just mark it off then.
Okay.
Okay. So, necessary but insufficient burden. There are a few popular ones that you should be comfortable reading in every single debate round. And we'll talk about some of the ones that we can make as responses to affs. But the NC itself should generally just be a nib. And the most common nib is just libertarianism or deontology. So I personally went for libertarianism most of my senior year as the negative. And just said violations of rights are bad, taxation is bad, things like that. The reason is because no matter what the affirmative response was, the best they could do was prove no violation of libertarian rights. Occasionally, an affirmative might get smart enough to figure out that there was a way to make libertarianism affirm, but generally not, right? Most of the time, the best you can do when responding to a deontological standard, or like libertarianism, is to say, there's no violation of rights. Does that affirm? No, they can't do anything other than not lose by answering the negative case, right? So make it a nib. So I generally recommend an NC framework that is deontological or libertarian or something like that. The other reason the reasons that nibs are good is because 1, there's no theory in traditional debate. They can't call you out for being abusive. If you were in circuit debate, you'd get called out for it. But it doesn't really matter. You can do whatever you want here. It makes the 1AR nearly impossible because if you place 2 or 3 nibs on the aff, it is already a massive time suck for them because they have to answer every single one of them, but they cannot win off of any of them, which detracts them from going for their own offense since they have to waste time answering your nibs. And nibs generally can sound really reasonable, right? It's not that hard to make a deontological standard pretty much a nib for the app. It's just impossible for them to win on it, and it's pretty easy to make it sound very reasonable, right? Like, of course it's my opponent's job to prove that they don't violate rights. How could you think that something is moral if it violates rights? And then that's it. That's a nib right there. You also want to make it a higher layer than the aff. So what does higher layer mean? Yeah.
It's voted on first.
Yeah, so it comes before the affirmative. It's a prior question. It is a prerequisite. It is whatever you want to insert there. But it's a higher layer, which is strategic because it wrenches away control from the affirmative. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the control stuff at the end of the 1 and C, so we can explain like why the 1 and C, the speech itself, should be really strong. So it needs to be a higher layer than the affirmative. Before we can get to questions of whether or not the affirmative is a good idea or not, you should always attempt to have an NC that establishes some sort of side constraint, which is a first, a prior question. Just like in policy making in the federal government, before we can consider whether or not a law is a good idea, you generally have to consider whether or not it's consistent with the Constitution, right? Because if it's unconstitutional, it does not matter how good of an idea it is. You can't pass that law. So similarly, you need to find something else, a side constraint upon all moral theories. For example, not torturing little babies or whatever. That comes before all of the affirmative arguments and all of the affirmative framework arguments. Once you have this is a higher layer. That means the NC comes first. The aff has to answer this to not lose, but they can't win off of it because, once again, we made it a nib. So, I'm going to read a short NC, a little bit faster than usual, just because for time's sake, and we'll discuss why this NC was so short and how it was a nib and what other small tricks I embedded in there. This was on the NATS topic my senior year about prioritizing national security over digital privacy. So, again, you don't have to flow, you just have to listen a little bit. I negate, since ought is defined by Merriam-Webster as a moral obligation, I value morality. Democracies require that we treat people as ends equally, as Professor Mark Warren explains. Society consists of the individuals who compose it. Thus, if a society is good, that means it is good for the individuals in society, because each individual life is an end in itself. Collective decisions ought to respect individuals. This moral intuition is central to democracy. Even if governments have different moral obligations than humans, at the very least, there's a basic duty to respect the humanity of each individual, and the fact that their constituents have worth is the only justification for governmental obligations in the first place. And using people as a means to an end violates their dignity and autonomy, course guard rights. A human being should never be used as a mere means to an end. Of course, we do use each other as a means to her ends all the time, but to treat someone as a mere means is to use her to promote your own ends in a way to which she does not consent. Treating a person as a mere means violates the dignity every human being possesses. Respect for humanity demands that we avoid all devices intended to override the autonomous choices of others. Thus, the value criterion is respecting individual status as ends, defined as treating people as rational individuals and avoiding the use of force to override people's autonomous choices, which is a side constraint on all governmental theories. The contention is that violating digital privacy treats people as means. This is because violating digital privacy takes information from people against that person's will and overrides the autonomous choices of individuals to decide when and where to reveal their personal information, which is the very definition of privacy. Given that the resolution poses a direct conflict between the two goals, the resolution mandates the violation of digital privacy, which means that by definition the individual did not consent, as Ahn et al. Explains, since with one consent, the one action concerned does not constitute a violation of privacy. To clarify, the state is permitted to take actions to an individual consents to, but violating digital privacy is uniquely bad because citizens don't even have the opportunity to consent as the information is taken against their will, as Van Buren writes. It's your choice to give data to private companies, however, you cannot opt out of the NSA. And it is not enough that they or other people benefit, they must consent to the practice, which is a side constraint on all moral theories. Finally, my advocacy outlines constraints the government cannot overstep. Arguments against my case need to explain how they generate an obligation to violate digital privacy, not merely its permission or as a necessity. So I have no idea how long that would be if I was reading it slowly, but probably like no more than 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. So this framework is simple, just like a libertarianism-esque framework, just some cards in there. If you're smart enough to point out that course guard card is about how individuals should relate to each other and not how governments should act, you'd be correct, but I was too lazy to ever substitute that card out. So the NC was a giant nib. Why is that?
You include consent as a side constraint.
Yeah, so proactively consenting to something does not at all make it moral, but not consenting to something definitively makes it immoral, right? So the affirmative could at best prove that it was not immoral to violate digital privacy, not that there was a moral obligation to do so. So the NC is already a giant nib, but there are also a few other nibs embedded in the NC as well. Well, the first one that's really popular and you should always use is permissibility. It was the last argument that I made, which is that arguments need to prove how they generate an obligation to violate digital privacy, not merely as permission or as a necessity. Permissibility is a great argument because there are 4 different categories, or at least some argue that there are 4 different categories of moral, like moral commands. So there's supererogatory, which is above and beyond the call of duty. There's obligatory, which is you're required by morality. There's permission, which means that you can do it or you cannot do it. And then there's prohibition, which is you cannot do it. And the AF generally has to win that they're obligatory, because odd is a moral obligation. Well, I just go for you're not obligated to do it, but it'd be permissible if you did it, right? And that's an answer that the AF generally has to spend a lot of time answering, because if they just win that their AF is a good idea, that doesn't prove an obligation, just permissibility. The NC was also pretty difficult to answer in a short period of time. It suffers from logical flaws, I agree, but those are hard to point out in the context of a debate round, especially a 4-minute 1AR. So if they waste time trying to point out logical flaws, that is a positive time trade-off for me. This NC is like 2:30-ish. Generally, people who will spend about 2:30 answering this in the 1AR. That is a perfect time trade-off for me. Because if I can get a 1-to-1 time trade-off in terms of the AF spending 1 second for every second of arguments that I make, I already have a 3-minute advantage. So that's why it's really important to have NCs that are really short, blippy, nibby, and difficult to answer. Here's the main reason for why you want to read an NC. Remember how we talked about yesterday that the AF needs to control the round and never let up control of the round, right? The neg needs to never let that happen. The AF should attempt to control the round, and you should, despite the AF's best attempts, do everything you can to wrench control away from the affirmative. An NC that is a higher layer automatically wrenches control away from the affirmative. The affirmative is no longer the most important question in the round. It is now the NC, something that you are much more prepared to debate, something that you are much more comfortable debating, right? If the AF attempts to reestablish control, they have to spend at least some of the 1AR answering your negative case, which is already a higher layer in the debate round. And you've wrenched away control because you're establishing arguments that are positive time trade-offs for you. Nibs are not just useful because they're abusive in the sense that AFs can't win on them. They're useful because the AF has to waste time on them. The goal of the 1NC, or at least one of the main goals of the 1NC, should be to waste as much 1AR time as possible. And nibs are a perfect way to waste as much 1AR time as possible. So I generally included the NC as a giant nib, the permissibility nib as in the NC, mostly because most AFs would have good arguments for why it was okay to violate rights, but they would never have an argument for why it was obligatory to violate rights. So permissibility was a good argument. Plus, this is a really easy to defend case. Like, violating people's consent is bad. Done. All right, any questions about the NC itself? So NC should be short, unturnable, nibs, higher layers than the AF. Deontology or libertarianism is really, really easy. Plus, it has the added benefit in a lay debate of being super easy to defend. Turns out most parents really like libertarianism, so they like their freedom. Alrighty, let's talk about attacking the affirmative in the first negative speech. You should have a strategy for attacking the affirmative. And it's not a strategy you should come up with in round. You should prepare to have attacked every single common affirmative on the topic before this round ever began. If you think about it, how many topics in the last 3 years had more than 3 different lay affirmatives on the topic? I guess virtually none. Almost every AF on the free speech topic was the same. Almost every AF on the right to housing topic was the same. Most of the AFs on the qualified immunity topic were the same. Most of the AFs on nuclear power were the same. Very few AFs that were different. So it shouldn't be that hard to spend a couple of hours preparing to attack the affirmative. So we're going to talk about how I think you should prepare to attack the affirmative. The first thing I think you need is a list of general terms that answers functionally every subset of AF, right? So AFs that are util, here's your list of terms. AFs that are social contract based, here's your list of terms. AFs that are Rawlsian based, here's your list of terms. AFs that are more deontological or whatever, here's your list of terms. Whatever it is, you should have a list of terms ready to go. I'd say 4 or 5. 4 or 5 good ones. Carded, ready to go. The reason you want these to be sort of generic and apply to every affirmative is because this wrenches away control from the AF. When the AF is now forced to answer a bunch of turns that the negative is much more prepared to debate on, then it's going to be a lot harder for the AF to reestablish control in the round. So this topic is a little bit troublesome because there's not really a great set of common turns to every affirmative. But for example, the happiness maximization turn. which is about how we can just enhance humans to just be maximally happy all the time, which means that under utilitarianism, you'd have to negate, since you could just engineer the best possible world for humans, is a good turn to read against every utilitarian AF, right? Doesn't matter if that AF has a really good inequality scenario about inequality rising enough to like cause massive harm to the environment. It doesn't matter if the AF has this really good super soldiers abuse scenario or whatever. You can just engineer people to be happy. This response is definitively a turn. It answers the affirmative case. It links underneath their framework, but it doesn't directly engage the affirmative's arguments, which means that they have to answer this like a separate argument now. Another thing that forces the 1AR to waste time, and another thing that makes the 1AR cede control to the negative, because now you're debating on your term, not theirs. So for any given topic, I assume most of you debated the free speech topic. For any given topic, you need just your list of general turns. On the free speech topic, there were some really good just general turns that every negative should have been reading. So every negative was probably just going to read the hate speech NC anyways, and then just read a bunch of turns for why hate speech turned all of the affirmative's arguments, right? And then needed some good, so just general turns that link to every single affirmative, no matter what, right? And that means the AF gets knocked off their game. Even when I was reading an AF, like I did yesterday, that was designed to directly preempt all of the hate speech stuff. If you just read a bunch of different hate speech stuff that makes the AF work really hard to interact with it, it's again, cedes control to the affirmative. All right, so you need a list of general terms that apply to the vast majority of AFs, right? 4 or 5, it's not that hard to find. When I was debating nationals, I just had a list of terms that applied to every terrorism AF, and a list of terms that applied to every cybersecurity AF, and a list of terms that applied to every social contract AF. Those are the only AFs on the topic. That was all I needed. It was like 4 or 5 pages of terms for each one of them, and I just picked the best 2 or 3 each time. All right, then we need to talk about preparing for specific affirmatives and not just categories of them. Well, this part generally doesn't require as much card-cutting prep because, as it turns out, it's unnecessary to cut cards to answer specific authors in lay debate. I did, but that was a waste of my time because I never got to read them. So it's just about like having prep to each specific affirmative, and then that way, before every time you go into a round, you kind of know, hey, this is what I'm going to read. I don't really need any prep time before the 1NC. I've already done all the prep beforehand. So in terms of what prep that you should be doing, you need to think about how the 1NC and the answers to the AF interact. And I think minimally the easiest way to do it is just to have a 1NC that is again a higher layer and responses that engage the affirmative directly in the sense that it is on the same level of the affirmative, like it concedes the utilitarianism framework and just makes a bunch of turns underneath it. And that way you have 2 separate outs to win the debate, but the affirmative has at best 1, right? But they have to answer like 3 separate layers to get there. They need to answer the NC, they need to answer the turns, and then they need to answer the defense that you played with the AF. So let's talk about, as if we were in the debate round, what we would answer on the affirmative case. The first thing I think you should make is overviews to the affirmative case when you're getting into the round. The reason is because most people tend not to flow these, and they just drop them, and they're easy auto wins. So I think my favorite one is just ought implies can. Ought implies can, which means that it's the affirmative's burden to prove that it is possible to do this. Otherwise, they generate impossible moral obligations, which is really bad. And you just like make an analytic argument for why the resolution would be impossible to implement or something like that. All right. If they drop this, it's game over. You ought not do things that are impossible. But it's something really easy to put it at the top of an affirmative case. Are there any sort of other common tricks that you like to have when you're answering the affirmative? No? All right. Ought implies can and permissibility are my 2 favorite ones. Some people like to make resolution-specific a prioris or reasons to automatically negate no matter what. I'm not a big fan of a prioris. I find them very difficult to explain to lay judges, but I think minimally the ought implies can and permissibility should always be in your arsenal. Both of those will take the 1AR at least like 10 or 20 seconds to respond to, and that's a really great positive time trade-off in your favor. So then we get to the framework stuff. I think you should be well prepared to defend libertarianism at this point such that you don't need to really extemp an argument against the framework. Against utilitarianism, you should have the same 3 reasons why util is bad every single time and the same 2 or 3 reasons to prefer libertarianism as a framework every single time, such that you either have to memorize or they're just written down and you don't need to think about it. As it turns out, it's like really easy to just framework dump in lay debate. So just like 3 quick reasons for why util is bad and 2 quick reasons to prefer the standard. This should take no more than like 30 seconds, right? Because our goal is to just make the 1AR hard. So if we split the 1NC about equally, right, a 2.5 minute, or sorry, unequally, a 2.5 minute NC, 30 seconds of responses to the framework. Now that leaves us with 4 minutes to just turn the crap out of the affirmative. And that's what you want to do. You want to turn the crap out of the affirmative. I'd say read 3 or 4 turns in every debate. That makes it incredibly difficult to be affirmative because each one of those turns is a very difficult thing for the affirmative to answer. The app has to spend like 45 seconds at least answering all 4 of the turns, and that doesn't even count the part where they extend their own case. And again, all we're trying to do is maximize time trade-offs for the negative here. So it's all about maximizing time trade-offs. When you're responding to the actual, so I would make an overview of turns. So like as an overview to the contentions, 1, 2, 3, or something like that. So maybe 3 turns that apply generally to every affirmative that aren't necessarily specific to the contentions at hand. The reason is it makes it difficult for the affirmative to extend their contentions to take out the turns, because these are in the overview, which means it's really difficult to flow the extensions from the affirmative to take out the NC, or to take out the NC turns. And that makes it really difficult for the judge to flow the affirmative's responses. Again, a little bit cheating here, but our goal is, again, to make the 1AR's job as hard as possible, not only in terms of maximizing time trade-offs, but by making the flow very difficult for them to understand. Then we get to the actual contentions itself, and I think that you need to just be sort of hiding arguments here and dumping arguments like crazy. Left and right, defensive arguments, 3-point everything, and I mean everything. So the contention itself gets 3 points, each card gets 3 points, and so if they have a contention with 2 cards and a contention tagline, and they have 2 of those contentions, so 4 cards and 2 contentions, you should have 18 responses to that. All right, you should have 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. Or that's not 18, is it? No, it is. You should have 18 responses to that.
3 for each card?
Yes.
Okay.
And here's the best argument I think you can make against every single piece of evidence, no matter what, and it's just no warrant. Now, I don't think you should use the term no warrant, because people get really annoyed at that really quickly. But I think you should say, this card does not assume X, or this card does not imply Y, or this card does not take into account Z. And just put this against every single piece of evidence. And the reason is because it takes so much time to explain why your card does account for something, as opposed to simply saying it doesn't account for something. Even if that card blatantly accounts for it, you can just say it doesn't account for it. And the 1AR has to waste 5 to 10 seconds explaining why it does account for it. If you do this to every single card, and you get 5 seconds out of it for each card, that is 20 seconds of the 1AR that you've wasted already, right? 4 cards at 5 seconds each, having to re-explain a warrant for the card, that's 20 seconds that you've wasted. It's perfect. It's just about treating and maximizing time trade-offs. I'd also say you should, against every single, instead of putting all of your turns at the top, so let's say you put 2 or 3 of turns in the overview, remember you want about 4 or 5 against each affirmative case, make a turn randomly against a card somewhere in the affirmative contention, and they won't catch it. If the turn is not the first thing that responds to a contention, they don't flow it, right? They're just like, oh, it's another defensive response to a card. But you just put it against a card, they're not going to catch it, they're going to drop it. It works every single time like a charm. You should, and that's really kind of it, right? Just like dump a lot, right? Just dump a lot on the affirmative case. It doesn't really matter if they're great quality responses. The real tactic here is that every single response, generally the affirmative will try to get to, they'll fail, and you already have an easy out, right? And the other reason is because the more red ink that covers the side of the affirmative flow that you have, right? Like if you have 18 responses to their contentions, plus the 4 or 5 to the framework, that's like over 20 arguments that they have to answer in the 1AR, and it's about psychologically confusing your opponent and making them anxious and scared to give a 1AR because they have to answer so many arguments. So, answering the affirmative case. It's about quantity, not quality. It's about hiding turns. It's about making nibs. It's about making overview arguments. It's about making no warrant claims to waste their time. And it's about solidly refuting any given affirmative that you can encounter, because there are only a few of them on any given topic. So I think most people kind of get 1 and C strategy. It's not that hard. Our goal is to just make the 1AR impossible. Against a strategy like this, even I would have a lot of time giving a 1AR that covered everything, because there's just so much to cover. And it's so abusive, right? But thankfully, what?
And you can't spread it either.
And you can't spread, right? So the 1AR cannot spread. The 1 and C can go slow and still dump 18 arguments, because it doesn't take any time to say, well, first off of this piece of evidence, it doesn't account for X. Second, it doesn't account for Y. And third, turn, and you just embed the turn in there. It's so easy to say all of that. It doesn't take any time whatsoever. But to answer every single one of those takes so much time. And more importantly, the 1AR is going to be super confused in terms of their flow, right? So they're going to signpost terribly against every single one of your arguments. Oh, one more thing I forgot to mention. Is that you should never have turns as the first argument against a contention. It should always be like the second. And the reason is not only because they don't flow the second response generally, but because they can't group your defensive arguments, right? Most of your defensive arguments are really similar to each other, right? Like your card doesn't warrant X or Y. But if you say, number 1, this card doesn't warrant X. Number 2, turn. Number 3, this card does not explain Z. Well, they can't group those very easily, because then the 1AR, they'll be like, now, off this piece of evidence, group the number 1s and 3. And the judge will be like, I'm really confused. And there you go. 1AR is messy now. All right. Okay, so being, and also, even though most people say do weighing in the 1NC, don't bother. Our goal is not to, like, be good in the 1NC. Our goal is to make the 1AR impossible. So, this sounds terrible. This sounds like a terrible negative strategy. Just blitz through everything to sound terrible, to like make the debate as hard as possible. It doesn't sound like we're really here about the clash. It doesn't sound like we're really being the traditional debater that people really want us to see. I talked on the first day about being a good ethos-y debater that have credibility, to make judges want to listen to you. And it doesn't sound like anything we've talked about really wants to make a judge listen to you, right? Like, this is just plain cheating. And even parents can catch on to the fact that this is plain cheating. But here's why you can get away with it. Because if the 1AR is so bad, you can be the nice savior that comes in the 2NR and says, I'm going to make this real easy for you, right? So in terms of strategy, the 1NC should be quantity over quality. It should be blitz dumping. It should make the round as messy as possible for the affirmative, not for the judge, but for the affirmative. And when the 1AR is desperately trying to scramble to retake control of the round because they've already lost their control of the round, the AF is now the lowest priority in the debate. Now they have to answer the NC, they have to answer the framework, and they have to answer the turns, all before they can even extend their AF as a winning argument in the debate. Once they've lost control over everything, and the 1AR is messy and awful and blippy and terrible and dropping everything left and right, the 2NR shifts tone and becomes the ethos-y, credible, pathos-y debater that judges want to see. Right? Now you spend the time being substantive. Now you go for quality over quantity. Now you slow down and really make the arguments the judge wants to hear. Now you make the round really simple, right? You go a little bit above the flow. You spend your time making the round really easy for the judge to understand. The 2NR can generally afford to start with an overview that's something along the lines of, I'm winning everything in this debate, and then clarify which things that you want to go for specifically, and only focus this round down to like 2 or 3 issues. The 2 or 3 issues that I almost always chose were just the NC as one of them, and then 2 of the turns, generally the ones that they undercovered. So that was my 3 voting issues right there. The NC, 2 turns. And this made this debate really, really simple for the judge to understand. Instead of having to wade through 18 plus arguments that the 1AR will have to make to answer all 18 of your responses, now they only have to evaluate like 3. And now you become the debater that the judges want to have. And every time this round gets messy, now it's no longer the negative's fault. It's entirely the affirmative's fault. It was the 1AR's fault for being really messy and sloppy. It was the 1AR's fault for dropping everything. It was the 1AR's fault for having bad signposting, right? Now it's your job to just clean up everything and be a good debater. So, I generally think that you should start on the lowest layer in the debate in the 2NR, although some people think otherwise. The lowest layer in this case being the AF. So, instead of extending all of the defense, instead of extending all of the 18 arguments you made, really what you want to do is just get above the flow here for a second. Pick the voting issues or the turns that you want to go for. All right, so on the affirmative contention 1, I'm going for this argument, which says that, X or Y or whatever, and this turns the affirmative case. And you also need to be sure to explain what a turn is, because lay judges don't know what a turn is, so you need to explain that. And then explain why that is a reason to vote negative. And then all you have to do is answer the maybe 1 or 2 AF responses that directly respond to this turn. Now, instead of this debate being 18 arguments huge, it's like only a few for every given voting issue. Spend time explaining each of these voting issues. Collapse down, be substantive, right? 45 seconds to a minute on each of these turns that you want to go for. The 2NRs that I gave at Nationals on the terrorism debate on the Nationals topic were like each turn was like a full minute of solid weighing, developed arguments, comparison between the warrants, etc. Because the 1NC might have just been card dumping and annoying blippy responses, but the 2NR was substantive and engaging. It answered these arguments like a judge wanted them to hear them answered because it really went into the deep warranting level of analysis that judges really want to hear, right? And you really shouldn't even bother extending most of the defensive arguments. You should really just go for turns against the AF. The AF should just lose the debate straight up within the first 3 minutes of the 2NR. So the 2NR I think should really be about 3 or 4 minutes on the AF case, 2 minutes on the negative case. 3 to 4 to explain your turns and to extend maybe 1 or 2 defensive arguments that you think are just totally true against the affirmative. But really no more, you should extend no more than like 4 or 5 arguments against any affirmative case. That's it, right? You also need to explain why this negates and why this is the first place that you can vote negative. I think the reason to start at the lowest layer to the top is to hedge your bets, right? Even if the aff somehow beats back the NC, even if the aff somehow beats back the framework, even if the aff somehow managed to extend some of their arguments, you just need to explain that the turns come first. And then, after you sort of explain some negative voting issues for about 3 or 4 minutes on the affirmative case, go to the negative case, extend this. You should be pretty good at framework debate at this point in time. Learn how to extend your util bad responses. Learn how to defend libertarianism. I don't think it's that difficult, and it doesn't take that much time to get used to saying rights are really good, respect your liberty. And just make the NC come first, right? And explain, look, all of the 2 prior voting issues presume that the affirmative is winning the NC debate, but they are not. This is the easiest place to vote negative because there's no chance of you voting affirmative. They've conceded, extend whatever argument for permissibility you have here that is merely permissible to violate rights at best. But if I prove that there's a violation of rights, you should vote negative, right? And then just explain the NC. It's a nib. It's really easy to win a nib because there's no way the aff can win off of it. I also generally don't ever bother extending any of the stupid arguments like on implies can or whatever in the 2 and R. I just put them in there to waste the app's time. I only extend them if they're totally dropped. So that's just sort of the sort of tech side of being negative. But again, as we talked about with being affirmative, there's a lot more to persuasion than just being a little bit technical. Learning how to extend voting issues and stuff. You don't need me to tell you that. That's like very obvious debate 101. Really what the 2 and R needs to do is shift the tone entirely. If the only way at this point that any 2AR should be able to win is when they do what I told you to do yesterday, which is go above the flow, tell a pathosy, ethosy story about the resolution, and ignore a lot of the turns. And you can't let that happen because people have lost to that before, and it's just kind of upsetting when you're the negative and just that good at tech debate and you lose to something like that. So what you need to do is you need to preempt the 2AR. Shift the persuasion game before the 2AR can. The 2AR was able to win yesterday because the 2AR was too busy scrambling to recover from an excellent 1AR, and because they forgot to spend the time telling you why this resolution mattered to the judge. They forgot to spend the time telling you why this resolution was true on a gut intuition level. They forgot to explain the ballot story. And you need to not be that negative. The reason for why you should leave yourself about a minute at the end of the 2 and R is really just for summation of voting issues and to be pathosy and to be ethosy. When the 2AR attempts to shift to that sort of narrative, right, when they attempt to be pathosy and ethosy in the 2AR when they're losing, instead of it being viewed as a persuasive technique, when you're the one who initiates it first, the 2AR just looks desperate, right? The 2AR just looks like they're scrambling for the last possible way to win the round. But if you already know that the 2AR is going to try to do something like that, where they just go above the flow and say, it's all about the pretty speak in here, gut intuition levels are true, intuition level arguments are true, it doesn't matter about the turns, it just matters about the truth of the resolution. Now when they do that, it's no longer persuasive, it's just desperate, right? This is the sort of part of the multiple independent ways to win. Not only do you need the 2 turns on the app and the 1 and the NC, both of which are on separate levels, to win this debate. You need your own pathosy stuff, right? And it's generally a little bit harder to be pathosy on the neg, right? Most topics are pretty aff-leaning in terms of the topic literature we discussed. Most of the neg topics tend to seem like really brutal in terms of like their humanity towards people. Like for example, the right to housing. What were you gonna say? Like they just don't deserve a house? That was just like the worst topic ever. And like negatives kind of sounded awful when they're just like, you can't give people houses. How dare you? But you need to find something, right? And I've generally found that the easiest way to be pathosy is just to appeal to the value of rights as important to people. So on the housing topic, generally I just went for libertarianism, like no positive rights to a house, and just be like, yes, while giving people a house might sound like a good idea, and we just sort of preempt the 2AR doing that, right? There's an intrinsic value that every human has that is overridden when you violate people's right to liberty. And when you view people as merely disposable objects to take money from to provide for other people, you violate the rights intrinsic to all human beings and then just like give some lofty, laudable defense of libertarianism, even though it's all totally false. Okay, so I think that's really basically it in terms of negating. It's really the 1 in C just needs to be the one makes the 1AR impossible. It makes positive time trade-offs for the negative. It makes too many arguments for the 1AR to respond to. The 1AR screws up because they've dropped all the tricks and the cheating parts that you have where you embed. Oh, wait, there's a few other cheating arguments I forgot to mention. Floating counterplans. Floating counterplans are really important. They should be like 2 responses to the AF, minimally. Floating counterplans, where you just advocate other solutions to solve the AF but don't defend any of them. Instead of guaranteeing people a right to a house, we could just give people universal basic income. And then off the second contention, instead of guaranteeing people a house, we could just guarantee that they don't get kicked out of their house or something like that. And just like advocate a bunch of floating things against the affirmative. You're allowed to do that. It's totally cheating, but you can do it in traditional debate. Shoot, there's some.
Is that in the 1 and C?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I very rarely ever extended them into the very rarely ever extended them into the 2 and R. But you know, like, why not? If you wanted to. Some other things. I know for a fact that we have a bunch of cheating arguments, a list of cheating arguments somewhere. I think we deleted it. That's so sad. We had a long list of like how to cheat at debate in traditional debate. So, if I remember the list correctly so far, it's nibs, like auto-implies can and permissibility, hiding turns, overviews, floating counterplans. What else? There's some other ways to cheat at debate, and I just totally forget them off the top of my head. That's so sad. I just wanted to talk about cheating in debate. Oh, mislabeling turns. This one's a good one. Don't ever say the word turn. Just, people don't know what it is anyways. You can explain it as a turn in the 2 and R, but if you don't label it as a turn, people are less likely to respond to it, so it's okay if you just don't label it as a turn. What else? Oh, right, the no warrant stuff is sort of cheating, yeah.
Wait, how would you label the turn instead? Would you just be like...
No, you just say like, just read the tagline without saying the word turn in front of it, right? Besides, a lot of judges hate hearing the word turn anyway, so it can't hurt to do that. But if you don't say the word turn, people will just disregard it, so it's great. What else? Could go for, no. You could say skepticism or something like that. I'm not sure how good moral skepticism is generally, but it's generally an interesting argument to the framework, where you say that if their framework is true because it accounts, or if their framework does not account for X, that means morality is impossible, which means that there is no moral obligations. It's like a little bit difficult to explain in some traditional rounds, but it might be worth looking into. So for example, all moral systems must respect that people have ends in themselves or something like that. And if the affirmative denies that, that means the moral system is incoherent, which means that there is no such thing as a moral obligation. A terrible example of a skepticism trigger, because that's not how you would generally read it in a circuit round, but it makes sense to lay judges. So you can say that morality is untrue if the affirmative does not account for it. And it's just a general framework response, but it's a good cheating argument that if AFs drop, just mean that you auto-negate.
Could you explain that again?
Just like skepticism, which is like we're not sure if morality exists. So what you could say is that any given affirmative framework must account for some part of a moral system, and if it can't account for that, that means it's incoherent and false, and morality doesn't exist. So for example, if your moral system does not, for example, take into account that people must be motivated internally to do things, or if it doesn't take into account that people must have reason to act in their own self-interest, then that means morality loses motivating force. It is empty, so there's no such thing as morality, or something like that. Again, these are bad examples of skep triggers because I'm trying to make them more lay debate friendly, but they're good arguments that read against the framework because people will treat them differently than they would a regular framework response, and they'll overcover them or badly cover them.
Okay.
What else was there? No, I think those are the main reasons, main ways to cheat in debate, so it's not that big of a deal. I think most of the cheating should occur in the 1 and C, again, mostly for the sole purpose of skewing the 1AR's time. All right, any other questions about negating and lay debate? I feel like I'm missing some stuff. Yeah.
What are good authors for side constraint arguments?
Just any Kantian or libertarian. Just like libertarianism.org has some great people that really think libertarianism is true for some reason. Yeah.
How So the way you said like how app has to struggle to answer all the neg terms, well, does app, is it necessary for them to answer all of them, or can they just like answer the ones that like are pertinent to their case?
Well, they have to answer all of them, right? It's just like, otherwise you could just spend the 2 hour blowing it up. So for example, in this topic, the happiness engineering argument does not directly respond to an argument about inequality, or does not directly respond to an argument about steroid use, but it definitely negates, right? Like if the affirmative concedes that happiness engineering is possible, then under utilitarianism you have to negate, right? Because you have to be able to engineer people to the maximum happy state. And it's a great response because it functions on the same level as all of the affirmative arguments. It turns the affirmative case, but it's not directly related to all of the affirmative arguments, which means they can't extend the affirmative arguments to take out this NC, right? Or this argument. Like, the affirmative case that I read yesterday was designed to preempt all of these common negative arguments. But if you take away the ability of the 1AC to do that, then the 1AR automatically becomes more inefficient and less in control of the debate. Yeah?
Wait, so the happiness is like, the happiness debate is basically saying that like, if we can put these AGTs in people in the mouth, we can just engineer them to be just as happy as we want to be, so there's no reason for inequality? Is that what it's saying?
Well, no, it's not that there's no reason for inequality. So if the AF says utilitarianism is true, then the only solution that the only course of action you can take in your utilitarian system is to make people as happy as possible. It doesn't matter if people would be unequal, because you can just engineer them to be really happy while they're unequal. Right? So it directly responds to the affirmative, but the affirmative can't extend their contention to take it out. So you want to find arguments like these on any given negative topic, or any given topic for the negative. Right? Negative prep is easy, right? You need like an NC that's like 4 pages long at max, with like maybe 10 or 20 pages of front lines, and then like maybe 30 pages of prep against against all of the AFs combined. Because you only need like 6 pages of prep for each AF. There's only 5 AFs. It's really easy. Like I did like 100 pages of neg prep for nationals, and I read like maybe 10 of them the entire tournament. It's like no point in doing lots of prep. It's a neg. It's just about focusing where your prep goes. All right, cool. If you have any questions, just find me at Socrates. But other than that, I think we're